Today's lecture considers the work of the UN Human Rights Council. We'll look at the major functions and activities of the Council, including the creation of the Advisory Committee, the continuation of the special procedures from the United Nations Human Rights Commission, and the holding of universal periodic reviews of all UN member states. We'll conclude the lecture by assessing the Council's achievements and shortcomings. Let's begin with a discussion of the Advisory Committee. The Advisory Committee replaces the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights. It's composed of 18 experts who are independent and serve in their personal capacities, and the Advisory Committee continues the functions, many of the functions, of the former Subcommission, in particular with regard to the special procedures and the 1503 complaints mechanism. What the Subcommission had by way of authority that the Advisory Committee lacks, however, is the power to initiate and draft its own studies, to draft new legal rules, and to adopt resolutions. Now, according to some commentators, this change or diminution, really, in the authority of the Advisory Committee relative to the Subcommission was an opportunity for the Human Rights Council to, if you will, have its cake and eat it too. That is, the Council could benefit from the independent study of issues and engagement, field work, standard setting, etc., that an independent expert body would provide, but without the sort of independent authority to take up issues that the Council would rather not investigate. I think it's perhaps premature to know whether the Advisory Committee is substantially weakened in this respect, but I do think it's important to note that it has somewhat less power than the body that it succeeded. What the Advisory Committee does do, in conjunction with the Council, is to assist with the operation of the special procedures. Those are, if you recall our discussion of the UN Human Rights Commission, the special rapporteurs, working groups, and independent experts that engage in studies of particular human rights topics, the so-called thematic mandates, or the human rights situation in particular countries, the so-called country mandates. As of October of 2013, you can see that there has been quite an increase in the number of thematic mandates, while the number of country-specific mandates has held rather steady. So here you see the voting screen for the decision of the Council in March of 2013 to renew the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran. Let's turn now to the thematic mandates. You can see here a number of examples of newly created thematic mandates, and this short list, there are quite a few others as well, gives you a flavor of the kinds of diverse human rights topics that these special rapporteurs and working groups are studying. Now, with respect to how these special rapporteurs and working groups carry out their mandate, it's important to note that the number of standing invitations to the special procedure mandate holders to visit a particular country has risen quite sharply since the creation of the Council. It's nearly doubled since 2006. And I think that's actually quite an important development because, as you'll recall, special rapporteurs and working groups don't have the ability to visit a country unless it has given its consent, which is most generally done through a standing invitation. Now, with respect to country-specific mandates, you can see here a number of different countries that are subject to special procedures, some of them quite recent, others dating back some 10 or 20 years. And this reflects the fact that there are quite a few countries where, in the view of the United Nations as a whole, there are some significant human rights problems. Now that you know a little bit more about the work of the Council, I'd like to step back and give you this schematic overview so you can see how the different procedures we've talked about fit together. So at the top of this diagram, you see the Human Rights Council, below it the Advisory Committee, and you also see as well some of the thematic and country-specific special procedures, as well as the working groups that report to the Council. In this boxed area, you will see the mechanisms for the 1503 confidential complaints procedure, which existed under the Commission and continues under the Council. The one institutional activity we have not talked about is the Universal Periodic Review mechanism. So let's turn to that issue now. Now recall that the Universal Periodic Review is intended to address the allegations of selectivity and political bias that existed in the last years of the Human Rights Commission's operation. The idea is that every UN member state would be subject to a peer review by other nations of its human rights record on a regular rotating basis. This UPR process, as it's known, was intended to complement the monitoring activities of the UN treaty bodies, the special procedures, and the 1503 complaints procedure, all of which we've studied. So how does a Universal Periodic Review actually work? Well, each state's human rights performance is evaluated based on a number of legal instruments: the treaties it has ratified, the UN Charter and the UDHR, customary international law, as well as the voluntary pledges and commitments that the state may have made when seeking election to the Council. The process to review all UN member states takes about 4 years, with about a quarter of the UN membership being reviewed in any given year. Here's a schematic that shows you how the UPR process works in detail, with the example of Australia's UPR review from 2011. You can see that this has quite a few similarities to the treaty body state reporting process, in the sense that the state initially gathers information and, in this case, as you can see, solicits input from the Australian Human Rights Commission, a national commission, and from NGOs, and also receives a compilation of findings from the UN High Commissioner's Office. That then leads to a review before a working group of the UPR, a subgroup of states that actually engages with the report of the state under review. The report is prepared. It leads to conclusions and recommendations to the state concerned. The state then decides which of those concluding recommendations that it will accept or reject, and that then becomes the basis for subsequent UPR reviews, as well as for follow-up in other international venues. So this gives you an overview of how the process of UPR works. And with that, I think we can turn to evaluating some of the achievements and shortcomings of the Council over the last 8 years since its creation in 2006. Here are some of what I would consider to be the prominent achievements: the increase in the number of thematic mandates as part of the special procedures, the UPR process reducing, although not eliminating, the charges of selectivity and political bias, the adoption of some quite forceful resolutions by the Council with regard to human rights violations in certain countries that were quite serious and widespread, and also, interestingly, the suspension of Libya in 2011 from the Council during the period when the Gaddafi regime was engaged in attempting to suppress civil uprising that occurred during the Arab Spring. So these are some of the achievements. What about some of the shortcomings? Well, regional bloc voting is still quite common. Some states with quite poor human rights records are still elected to the Council, although it's worth noting that they would only serve for 3 years with the possibility of renewal, but then they would need to step down. So the idea would be to rotate the membership among a larger number of countries. Not all states have made voluntary pledges and commitments when standing for election, although an increasing number do. And some critics claim that the UPR process, precisely because it's peer-reviewed, actually provides a kind of cover or credibility for countries that have serious human rights problems. One possible remedy for that would be to permit greater engagement of NGOs and civil society organizations. Now that we've studied the UN human rights system as a whole, I want to show you a schematic that you've seen before so you can get a sense of how all the pieces fit together. We began by studying the treaty bodies, those independent expert groups which are constituted for each of the major UN human rights agreements, but that can only review the human rights practices of states parties with respect to that particular treaty. We then turn to look at the charter bodies, the Human Rights Council, replacing the UN Human Rights Commission in 2006, the Advisory Committee replacing the Subcommission at the same time, and we also looked at the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and her office, which provides assistance for all of these processes. And lastly, we looked at the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism, which was established in response to allegations of political bias and selectivity that plagued the Commission in its final years. I'll end the lecture by giving you some resources for additional information about how the Human Rights Council functions, the activities that it performs, and assessments of its achievements and shortcomings.